The winter sun was still low over French Indochina on the morning of December 20th, 1941, when the deep, metallic roar of 10 twin-engine Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers echoed across the Hanoi airfield. Their silver wings glinted as ground crews waved them off, each aircraft loaded with 500-pound bombs and incendiaries destined for one of China's most vital cities, Kunming, the last link in the famous Burma Road. For the Japanese airmen of the 12th Sentai, it was a familiar routine. For a full year, they had bombed Kunming with impunity. The Chinese defenders possessed almost no modern aircraft, no radar, and little anti-aircraft firepower. Each mission had been a calm, calculated exercise in destruction. The pilots expected the same on this particular morning, a quiet 300-mile flight north, a clear run over the target, and an unchallenged return home. But the skies over Asia were changing. Thousands of feet below the bomber's flight path, Chinese civilians crouched in caves and makeshift shelters, listening. They were part of an improvised but remarkably efficient Jingbao early warning system, a network of watchers who used telephones and radios to relay the approach of enemy aircraft. The warning rippled toward Kunming faster than the bombers themselves. Somewhere on the ground, a messenger sprinted to a dusty airstrip where a handful of American pilots stood by their machines, sleek Curtiss P-40 Tomahawks painted with snarling shark mouths and red, white, blue Chinese insignia. These were not ordinary Chinese aircraft, and their pilots were not ordinary soldiers. They were part of a brand new, secretive unit officially known as the American Volunteer Group, or AVG, though the world would soon know them by another name, the Flying Tigers. On that cold morning, 4 of their fighters, led by the brash and capable Lieutenant Scarsdale Jack Newkirk, lifted into the air from the rough Kunming runway. They had received word that Japanese bombers were inbound from the south. Their orders were simple and direct: intercept and destroy. As the bombers approached within 30 miles of their target, the Japanese formation suddenly caught sight of 4 fast-moving specks climbing to meet them. What had been a routine mission instantly turned into chaos. The P-40s dove like hawks out of the sun, .50 caliber guns chattering. Tracer fire tore through the formation, and explosions erupted as one, then another bomber spiraled down in flames. In less than 10 minutes, the Japanese formation was broken. 4 bombers plunged earthward, the rest jettisoned their loads and fled toward Hanoi, pursued by victorious American pilots. Not one Flying Tiger was lost. The young aviators returned to Kunming, their spirits soaring, performing slow victory rolls above the airfield before landing amid cheers from Chinese soldiers and civilians. That skirmish marked the first combat mission of the Flying Tigers, a baptism of fire that electrified the region. Later reports confirmed that 3 additional bombers never made it back to base. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Lee Chennault, a sharp-eyed, craggy veteran who had trained these men in unconventional tactics, listened to their excited debrief. He congratulated them, his gravelly voice cutting through the celebration. Then, true to his relentless nature, he added with a thin smile, the story of the Flying Tigers did not begin in the skies over China. It began years earlier, in the mind of one determined man who refused to accept the limits of conventional thinking. Lee Chennault, a retired U.S. Army Air Corps officer, had spent the late 1930s in China as an aviation advisor to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and his charismatic wife, Madame Chiang Kai-shek. There, amid war, poverty, and political chaos, Chennault began building the foundation of what would become the most famous mercenary air unit of World War II. By 1940, the situation in China was desperate. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force ruled the skies, bombing Chinese cities and supply routes with brutal regularity. The Chinese Air Force was shattered, its few remaining aircraft outdated, its pilots poorly trained, and its maintenance facilities nearly non-existent. Chennault had been trying for years to reform and train the Chinese air arm, but with little success. Still, he never stopped insisting that properly trained fighter pilots, using disciplined tactics, could stop the bombers that terrorized Chinese civilians. His chance finally came in 1941, months before the United States officially entered the war. With Japan tightening its grip on East Asia, Chennault returned to Washington, D.C., accompanied by Madame Chiang's brother, T.V. Soong, a shrewd diplomat and financier. Together, they lobbied the U.S. government to secretly support China by allowing the recruitment of American military personnel to serve under Chinese command. The plan was delicate. Technically, the United States was still neutral. But President Franklin D. Roosevelt, sympathetic to China's plight and impressed by Chennault's conviction, quietly signed an executive order permitting the creation of a volunteer Air Force. The project would be disguised as a private venture under a Delaware-based company called China Defense Supplies Incorporated, funded with nearly $9 million provided by the Chinese government. The mission was clear: form an elite fighter group of American pilots and mechanics to defend the Burma Road and China's interior from Japanese air attacks. The unit would consist of 3 squadrons, each named after a biblical or symbolic reference: the Adam and Eve Squadron, the Panda Bears Squadron, and the Hells Angels Squadron. Together, they would comprise the American Volunteer Group, AVG. Recruiting began in secret in the spring of 1941. Chennault's representatives visited U.S. Army Air Corps, Navy, and Marine bases across the country, searching for young men eager for adventure, or at least a higher paycheck. Here's an opportunity for real experience, combat experience, recruiters promised. The offer was tempting. Monthly pay ranging from $250 to $750, all expenses covered, and a $500 bonus for every enemy aircraft shot down. By midsummer, over 200 men had signed contracts. Roughly 1/3 came from the Army Air Corps, half from the Navy and Marine Corps, and the rest from civilian aviation. They were a mixture of idealists, thrill-seekers, and professional soldiers, united by the promise of action at a time when America was still at peace. The aircraft they would fly were Curtiss P-40 Tomahawks, powerful but imperfect fighters originally intended for Britain's Royal Air Force. The RAF had rejected them as obsolete, but to Chennault, they were ideal: sturdy, fast, and heavily armed, perfect for the dive-and-zoom tactics he intended to teach. By July 1941, the first crated P-40s were on their way to Rangoon, Burma, shipped through Singapore. The pilots, traveling under civilian cover, posing as missionaries, salesmen, or even circus performers, sailed from San Francisco. They carried false passports and were warned not to draw attention. Their destination: Taungoo, a rough airstrip in central Burma that would serve as their training base. When they arrived, they found the situation as primitive as it was challenging. The heat was suffocating, mosquitoes swarmed in clouds, and food was scarce. There were no barracks, only bamboo huts. Yet, under these harsh conditions, the volunteers began the transformation from a ragtag group of mercenaries into a disciplined fighting force. Chennault drilled his men relentlessly. He taught them to think differently about air combat, to fight smart, not daringly. The Japanese aircraft, particularly the Mitsubishi Zero, could outclimb and outturn the heavy P-40, but the American fighter had advantages in speed, diving power, and durability. Never dogfight a Zero, Chennault warned. Hit fast, hit hard, then get away. Every day, he stood on a rickety bamboo platform with binoculars in hand, watching his pilots train, barking orders through a megaphone. Accidents were common. 3 men were killed in training, but gradually, the group grew confident. Their shark-nosed fighters became a symbol of menace and pride. By December 1941, the Flying Tigers were ready for combat, just as the world changed forever with the attack on Pearl Harbor. Overnight, their secret war became part of a global one. They would soon find themselves not only the first Americans to strike back at Japan, but also symbols of hope for 2 nations fighting to survive. Next time, get them all. The legend of the Flying Tigers had begun. The dawn of December 20th, 1941, broke cold and thin over the misty hills surrounding Kunming, the provincial capital of Yunnan, China. The war in the Pacific was barely 2 weeks old. The United States was still reeling from the disaster at Pearl Harbor, the fall of Guam, and the onslaught across the Philippines and Malaya. But in the remote skies over southwest China, a small group of American volunteers was about to change the tone of the war. At a makeshift airfield carved into the plateau near Kunming, for shark-nosed Curtiss P-40 Tomahawks stood ready. Painted in the dark green and brown camouflage of the Chinese Air Force, their gaping, toothy mouths seemed almost to grin at the morning light. The pilots inside were members of the Panda Bears Squadron, one of 3 units in the American Volunteer Group, AVG. Their leader that day was Lieutenant John Scarsdale Jack Newkirk, a tall, sharp-tongued former U.S. Navy flyer from New York. Word had come from the Jingbao network, the early warning system Chennault had built from scratch, a web of spotters, radios, and telephones stretching across hundreds of miles. The message was clear: enemy bombers inbound from the south. 10 Japanese Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers were on their way from Hanoi, loaded with explosives meant for Kunming. The Japanese had grown complacent. For a year, their bombers had flown over Chinese territory without opposition. They had no fighter escort. To them, this was just another routine mission. But that morning, nothing would be routine. From his operations shack, Colonel Lee Chennault studied the incoming reports. Years of frustration, of being ignored by the U.S. Army Air Corps, of building China's defenses from the ground up, had led to this moment. Now his volunteers would face their first true test. He radioed Newkirk's group to intercept. The P-40s roared down the dirt runway, their propellers scattering dust and stones. As they climbed into the blue, the pilots switched to combat formation. The plan was simple: strike once, hard, and vanish. Chennault's doctrine of hit-and-run combat was about to prove itself. At around 9 a.m., 30 miles southeast of Kunming, the Japanese formation came into view. 10 bombers flying in neat, confident rows, sunlight flashing off their polished aluminum fuselages. Then, out of the sun, came the Tomahawks. Newkirk and his wingman dove first, guns blazing. Tracer fire ripped through the lead bomber, which exploded in a fireball that lit the clouds. Seconds later, 2 more P-40s swept in from below, raking the enemy formation with .50 caliber machine gun bursts. The air filled with debris and smoke. Within minutes, 4 bombers were shot down, tumbling into the countryside below. The surviving Japanese pilots, stunned by the sudden and ferocious attack, panicked. They jettisoned their bomb loads before even reaching Kunming and fled southward, their formation shattered. Not a single Flying Tiger was lost. When the Tomahawks landed back at Kunming, the airfield erupted in cheers. Chinese ground crews, mechanics, and townspeople gathered to greet the returning pilots. The young Americans taxied to a stop, climbed from their cockpits, and waved, grinning through soot and sweat. The victory had been decisive, quick, and morale-boosting beyond measure. Chennault met them on the field, his expression typically stoic. He congratulated the men, but tempered his praise with characteristic grit. "You did well," he said, "but next time, get them all." News of the victory spread quickly through the Allied world. In a time when headlines were filled with American defeats, the Flying Tigers' triumph over Kunming was a bright spark in the darkness. The Chinese newspapers hailed the unit as the guardians of the western skies. In the United States, though few yet knew their name, the legend of the Flying Tigers was already taking shape. For Chennault, it was validation. His unorthodox tactics had worked. Well-led fighter pilots could indeed bring down enemy bombers, just as he had always claimed. And for the men of the American Volunteer Group, the battle over Kunming was more than a victory, it was a baptism. They had proven that a handful of determined volunteers could face the Empire of Japan and win. The Flying Tigers' triumph over Kunming was only the beginning. Within days, the Japanese intensified their attacks, shifting their focus westward toward Burma, the key to China's lifeline, the Burma Road. Whoever controlled Rangoon, Burma's port capital, controlled the flow of supplies into China. If the city fell, China would be cut off from the outside world. For Colonel Lee Chennault, the situation was clear. The next battles would be fought not over Chinese skies, but above the jungles and coastlines of southern Burma. He ordered his men to relocate part of their force to Minga-laden airfield, near Rangoon. The Hell's Angel Squadron, led by Lieutenant Arvid Olsen, would take the lead. The date was December 23, 1941, barely 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor. Rangoon's skies shimmered with heat as a dozen P-40 Tomahawks took off to intercept incoming Japanese bombers reported over the Gulf of Martaban. They were joined by several Brewster Buffaloes from Britain's Royal Air Force No. 67 Squadron, a small group of determined but outmatched British and New Zealand pilots flying outdated planes. Above the glinting sea, the Flying Tigers spotted the enemy, a formation of sleek, twin-engine Ki-21 bombers, escorted by nimble Japanese fighters. The sky erupted in battle. The Tomahawks dove from altitude, unleashing streams of tracers that sliced through the bombers' formations. Several Japanese aircraft burst into flames, their fuel tanks igniting as they fell into the bay below. When the smoke cleared, 5 bombers and 4 enemy fighters were down. But the victory came at a cost. 1 American pilot was killed, another forced to bail out over the jungle. To Chennault, the losses were painful. He had few men and fewer aircraft to spare. "Every pilot," he reminded his squadron leaders, "is worth more than gold." Then came Christmas Day, 1941, a day the men would never forget. The sun had barely risen when the first reports came in. More than 70 Japanese bombers and nearly 40 fighters were approaching Rangoon. It was the largest enemy formation yet seen in the region. The 12 operational Hells Angels and 18 RAF Buffaloes scrambled to meet them. The odds were hopelessly uneven, almost 5-1, but the Flying Tigers had learned well from their commander. As the bombers reached Rangoon, the Tomahawks attacked in coordinated pairs, slicing through the Japanese formation, firing short, precise bursts before diving away to safety. Explosions rippled across the sky. The air was thick with smoke, fire, and shrapnel as aircraft from both sides twisted and plunged through the chaos. By the time the battle ended, the airfield was littered with debris and burning wrecks. Yet the results were astonishing. The AVG and RAF together claimed 32 Japanese planes destroyed, including both bombers and fighters. The Flying Tigers lost only 2 Tomahawks and, miraculously, no pilots. The victory over Rangoon was one of the most one-sided air battles of the early war. In the aftermath, 3 AVG pilots became aces in a single day, a record unmatched for the rest of the Tigers' brief but brilliant existence. Chennault's tactics, team fighting, diving attacks, and hit-and-run maneuvers had proven devastating against Japan's seemingly superior air power. His men, once dismissed as mercenaries, were now heroes in the eyes of both the Chinese and British. In the streets of Rangoon, jubilant citizens raised Chinese and American flags together. Local newspapers hailed the Flying Tigers as the angels of the Burma sky. For a moment, the Allied world, reeling from defeat elsewhere, had something to celebrate. But Chennault remained cautious. "Victory is temporary," he told his pilots grimly that night. "The enemy will be back, and next time he'll bring friends." He was right. The next weeks would bring a relentless aerial campaign over Burma, and the Flying Tigers would be pushed to their limits. Yet against impossible odds, their courage and skill would carve their names forever into the history of the Second World War. By the start of 1942, the name Flying Tigers had begun to echo far beyond the jungles of Burma and the mountains of Yunnan. In China, they were heroes. In Britain, they were saviors of Rangoon. And in the United States, where grim headlines from Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Philippines filled every newspaper, they became a symbol of hope. The Americans in Chennault's small, ragtag Air Force were fighting and winning at a time when nearly everyone else seemed to be losing. The press soon transformed their exploits into legend. At the Mingaladen and Kunming airfields, the Flying Tigers were still only about 50 pilots strong, supported by a few hundred mechanics, armorers, and radio operators. Their planes were patched with canvas, their spare parts scavenged from wrecks. The P-40 Tomahawks were sturdy but aging. Their Allison engines coughed in the thin mountain air, and the tropical humidity corroded metal faster than it could be cleaned. But in the hands of the AVG pilots, they were fearsome machines. What made them stand out, apart from their shark-faced noses, was the spirit that Chennault had instilled in them, boldness mixed with discipline. Every man knew his role. Every pilot knew Chennault's rules. Never turn with a Japanese fighter. Always attack from above. Fire in short, deadly bursts. And most importantly, live to fight again tomorrow. Their combat philosophy was pragmatic, not romantic. Chennault didn't believe in aerial duels or gallant chivalry. War, he said, was mathematics. Angles, energy, timing. "We fight to win," he told his men, "not to die bravely." As January unfolded, the Japanese launched raid after raid across southern Burma. The Flying Tigers scrambled almost daily, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day, intercepting bombers, strafing airfields, and harassing enemy convoys. Outnumbered in nearly every engagement, they fought with ruthless precision. In just the first 10 weeks of combat, Chennault's men engaged the enemy 31 times. They claimed over 200 Japanese planes destroyed, and probably another 40 damaged or downed out of sight. The AVG's own losses were remarkably light, 16 P-40s destroyed and 6 pilots killed in action. The impact was enormous. Japanese commanders began to complain that the skies over Burma had become infested with pirate planes. Tokyo radio denounced the Americans as foreign bandits flying Chinese machines. They even threatened to treat any captured Flying Tigers as guerrillas, not prisoners of war, a warning that only made the pilots prouder of their name. Back home, American newspapers picked up the story. The Chicago Daily News ran headlines about the mysterious Flying Tigers defending China. Hollywood producers and comic book artists jumped at the tale. Young American adventurers, flying for freedom in a faraway land, painted dragons and tiger emblems on their planes, battling the rising sun over the mountains of Asia. What few outsiders knew was that the Flying Tiger nickname itself had begun as an artistic accident. Early in 1942, Walt Disney Studios, already involved in wartime propaganda, sent Chennault's men an official squadron insignia, a winged Bengal tiger leaping through a blue V for victory symbol. It fit perfectly. The image appeared on the P-40 Tales on jackets, even on the sides of trucks. The Flying Tiger's identity was complete. For the Allied cause, morale was a fragile resource. The AVG's victories were small in scale but immense in psychological value. Their success proved that Japanese air power could be beaten. For every Chinese family who looked up and saw a shark-nosed fighter chasing away bombers, for every Allied soldier who read about them in the papers, the Tigers represented courage, resistance, and the promise of eventual victory. Yet, even as the legend grew, the strain was showing. Chennault's men were exhausted, constantly short of supplies, and fighting on multiple fronts. Their airfields were bombed repeatedly, and many pilots lived on the edge of survival, burned out, feverish, or half-starved. Still, whenever they climbed into the cockpits, they carried not just bombs and bullets, but the weight of hope. And hope, in those dark early months of 1942, was perhaps their most powerful weapon. By March, the war in Burma was entering its deadliest phase. Rangoon was in flames, the Japanese were advancing north, and the Flying Tigers were preparing for their hardest fight yet. The legend was taking flight, but the storm ahead would test the Tigers more severely than ever before. Long before he became the fierce, cigar-chomping commander of the Flying Tigers, Lee Chennault was a restless dreamer from the American South, a man shaped as much by frustration as by vision. Behind the myth of the old leather-faced general, who outsmarted the Japanese, lay the story of a stubborn maverick who refused to fit into the military mold of his time. He was born on September 6, 1890, in the small town of Commerce, Texas, the son of a cotton planter and schoolteacher. His family descended from French Huguenots, and his lineage traced back to both Sam Houston and Robert E. Lee, a heritage that carried a certain pride but little fortune. When Claire was still a boy, the Chennaults moved to Gilbert, Louisiana, a quiet town on the bayou where life revolved around church, crops, and the slow current of the Mississippi River. Claire's early years were a blend of hard work and mischief. He studied in a one-room schoolhouse, hunted ducks in the swamps, and roamed barefoot through cotton fields. He later described those days as a Tom Sawyer childhood under a Louisiana sun. Though quiet and serious by nature, he had a deep competitive streak that would mark him for life. In 1909, Chennault entered Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, where he joined the ROTC and dabbled in sports, track, baseball, basketball. But tragedy struck when his stepmother died, and he dropped out to support his family. He eventually earned a teaching certificate at Louisiana State Normal College and, at just 20 years old, became a school principal in the small town of Athens, near Shreveport. It was there that two great passions entered his life, aviation and love. At the Louisiana State Fair, he watched a Curtiss biplane wobble into the air, a noisy, fragile machine that nonetheless captured his imagination. "I have tasted of the air," he would later write, "and I cannot get it out of my craw." Around the same time, he met and married Nellie Thompson, a bright and warm young teacher. Together they would have 7 children, 6 sons and 1 daughter. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Chennault enlisted, attending officer training at Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indiana. He was commissioned a first lieutenant in the infantry, but like many ambitious young men, he wanted to fly. The infant U.S. Army Air Service was still struggling to define itself, yet Chennault saw in it the future of warfare. Transferring to the Army Signal Corps' aviation section, he earned his wings in 1919. His early flying career was unremarkable, a few routine patrols along the Mexican border, some training assignments, but something in aviation captivated him. When his initial service ended, he briefly returned home to plant cotton. The venture failed miserably, and he soon realized that farming could never compare to the freedom of the skies. "The land holds a man down," he told his father, "but the air, sets him free." Rejoining the regular army later in 1920, Chennault began to make a name for himself as both a skilled pilot and a sharp thinker. But he also developed a reputation for being difficult, even insubordinate. He questioned orders, challenged his superiors, and openly criticized the doctrines that dominated U.S. air policy in the interwar years. To Chennault, the obsession with heavy bombers, the belief that giant formations of bombers could always reach their targets, was dangerously naive. He argued that agile, well-coordinated fighter planes could intercept and destroy any bomber formation if properly led. The Air Corps hierarchy dismissed him as a troublemaker. But Chennault was undeterred. While stationed in Hawaii in the 1920s, he commanded the 19th Pursuit Squadron and began experimenting with new tactics. He treated aerial combat like chess, analyzing every possible angle of attack, teaching his pilots to fight in pairs and teams rather than as lone knights of the air. By the 1930s, he was an instructor at the Air Corps Tactical School at Langley Field, Virginia. There he wrote and lectured passionately about defensive pursuit, his belief that fighters, properly directed by an early warning network, could defend entire nations from air raids. He even proposed a nationwide spotting system that foreshadowed radar control, an idea far ahead of its time. His teachings inspired younger officers but infuriated the bomber generals who ran the Air Corps. "You can't stop bombers," they told him. "The bomber will always get through." Chennault's response was blunt: only if the bomber's pilot has no fighter on his tail. In 1937, worn out by bronchitis and partial deafness from years of open cockpit flying, Chennault retired from the Army at the rank of lieutenant colonel. He was 47, bitter, and convinced that his country had no place for men who thought differently. Yet fate was waiting for him in the East. That same year, a letter arrived from Madame Chiang Kai-shek, the elegant and politically powerful wife of China's nationalist leader. Japan had just invaded China, and she needed someone who understood modern air defense. Word of Chennault's brilliance and his stubborn independence had reached her through military attaches. Would he, she asked, come to China to help build a new air force? Chennault accepted. Within weeks, he was on a steamer bound for the Far East, an unknown American officer heading into a war that would, in time, make his name one of the most famous in aviation history. When Claire Chennault returned to military duty in the 1920s and 1930s, the U.S. Army Air Corps was still a young, evolving force, unsure of its own identity. To most senior officers, air power meant strategic bombing, the belief that large fleets of bombers could strike deep into enemy territory, destroy factories and cities, and force a nation to surrender. It was a seductive idea, one that promised victory from the sky, without the horrors of trench warfare. Chennault didn't buy it. To him, the Air Corps' fixation on the invincible bomber was not only flawed, it was dangerous. "There is no such thing as an invincible machine," he often said. "Only invincible ideas." He believed that well-trained fighter pilots, flying fast and coordinated missions, could protect cities, fleets, and armies far better than bomber squadrons ever could. But in an institution dominated by men like General Hap Arnold and General Ira Eaker, who championed strategic bombing theory, Chennault's views were unwelcome. He quickly earned a reputation as an outspoken contrarian, a man who challenged authority too often and too loudly. His gravelly voice, rough manners, and Louisiana drawl didn't help. To his superiors, he was abrasive, an officer who didn't play the game. Still, he was brilliant. During his posting to Hawaii's Ford Island between 1923 and 1926, Chennault commanded the 19th Pursuit Squadron and began testing new concepts in aerial tactics. He studied the formations of birds, the physics of airflow, and even boxing maneuvers to understand how best to outfight an opponent in the air. He taught his pilots to fly as teams, attacking from above and behind, striking fast, and breaking away before the enemy could react. It was an approach decades ahead of its time. He also began to develop the idea of an early warning system, long before radar became a military reality. Using radios and observers stationed on the ground, he envisioned a network that could track incoming bombers and guide fighters to intercept them efficiently, a concept he would later perfect in China with the Jingbao system. By 1929, Chennault had been promoted to captain, and his theories were becoming widely discussed, if not officially embraced. His lectures at the Air Corps Tactical School in Virginia, and later at Maxwell Field, Alabama, drew both admirers and critics. He published numerous essays, and in 1935, a textbook titled The Role of Defensive Pursuit, which became a foundational work in fighter tactics. His students remembered him vividly. One of them, future General Haywood Possum Hansel, recalled, "He was the kind of man who could make you see the fight in your head. You could feel it, the climb, the dive, the kill." Yet Hansel himself would later help design the strategic bombing campaigns Chennault so fiercely opposed. Chennault's uncompromising personality made him both respected and resented. He had no patience for bureaucracy, and his temper was legendary. He'd chew you out one moment, a fellow officer said, and buy you a beer the next. His subordinates adored him, but his superiors saw a rebel. In 1932, eager to demonstrate that fighter planes could operate with precision and discipline, Chennault formed an aerobatic team known as 3 Men on a Flying Trapeze. Flying in breathtakingly close formation, he and 2 other pilots performed daring loops, spins, and rolls across the country, showcasing the potential of coordinated air maneuvers. Crowds loved it, but the Air Corps brass dismissed it as circus flying. Still, Chennault's point was clear. With training, discipline, and teamwork, pursuit aviation could be both graceful and deadly. But by the mid-1930s, the tide was turning against him. The Air Corps Tactical School stopped teaching pursuit tactics altogether, focusing instead on bomber strategy. Chennault's health was also deteriorating. Years of exposure to wind and engine noise had left him partially deaf, and constant flying in open cockpits had damaged his lungs. In 1937, after 17 years of service, he was forced into early retirement. He left the Army a lieutenant colonel, embittered and convinced that the leadership had buried the future of air warfare beneath piles of doctrine and politics. Yet what seemed like an ending was only the beginning. A few months later, a cable arrived from the Chinese nationalist government. It bore the personal request of Madame Chiang Kai-shek, the First Lady of China. She had heard of Chennault's expertise in fighter tactics and wanted him to come to China to help rebuild their shattered air force. The U.S. Air Corps might not have wanted him, but China did. So with little fanfare and no official backing, Claire Chennault packed his few belongings, said goodbye to his family, and boarded a steamer across the Pacific. He was 50 years old, half-deaf, chronically ill, and unemployed. But he was also free at last to prove his theories in the one place that desperately needed them. Ahead lay war, hardship, and the greatest vindication of his life. When Claire Chennault stepped off the ship in Shanghai in May 1937, he entered a world already on the brink of catastrophe. Japan had occupied large parts of northern China and was preparing for a full-scale invasion. The Chinese nationalist government, led by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, was fighting a losing battle against a far stronger, more modern enemy. China's Air Force, in particular, was in shambles. It looked impressive on paper, with roughly 500 aircraft listed in its inventory, but only a fraction of those were airworthy. The rest were wrecks, obsolete biplanes, or grounded by lack of spare parts. The few operational fighters were flown by pilots trained in different countries: China, Italy, Germany, even Russia, each using different tactics, languages, and equipment. The result was chaos in the air. Into this confusion walked Chennault, a short, wiry man with sun-darkened skin, a rasping voice, and a habit of chewing cigars down to stubs. He had come at the personal invitation of Madame Chiang Kai-shek, the glamorous and influential First Lady of China. Educated in the United States, fluent in English, and fiercely patriotic, she saw aviation as the key to defending her homeland, and Chennault as the man to make it happen. Their partnership was instant and unlikely. Madame Chiang, known to her people as Song Mei-ling, embodied grace, diplomacy, and refinement. Chennault, on the other hand, was blunt, stubborn, and distinctly unpolished. Yet, in each other, they found what the other lacked. She admired his military genius and unshakable honesty. He admired her courage, intellect, and relentless determination. "She will always be a princess to me," he wrote in his diary after their first meeting. Within weeks of his arrival, the Second Sino-Japanese War erupted. On July 7, 1937, Japanese and Chinese troops clashed near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing, igniting 8 years of total war. Suddenly, Chennault found himself not as an advisor, but as a commander in a nation under siege. He quickly realized how dire the situation was. The Japanese possessed hundreds of modern bombers and fighters, flown by well-trained crews with years of combat experience. The Chinese Air Force, meanwhile, could barely get its planes off the ground. It was not an air force, Chennault later recalled, it was a list of wrecks. Undeterred, he set to work. Using his background from the Air Corps Tactical School, he reorganized China's air command structure and introduced disciplined, coordinated tactics, the same hit-and-run principles he would later teach the Flying Tigers. He trained Chinese and foreign volunteer pilots alike, drilling them in teamwork, formation flying, and deflection shooting. He also began building an early warning network, the precursor to the famed Jingbao system. From mountaintops, river valleys, and city rooftops, hundreds of Chinese civilians served as observers. With telephones, radios, and signal flares, they could report incoming enemy aircraft long before they reached their targets. It was an ingenious, low-tech solution that would one day save countless lives. Despite these efforts, the odds remain hopeless. The Japanese launched devastating air raids against Shanghai, Nanking, and later Chongqing. Chennault watched helplessly as cities were burned to ashes. It was war in its most naked form, he wrote. The sky itself had become the enemy. Still, his reforms began to show results. The Chinese pilots, many of whom had been terrified at first, started fighting back with newfound confidence. Against overwhelming odds, they managed to shoot down several Japanese bombers during the defense of Nanking in late 1937. Their success was small but symbolic. For the first time, the people of China saw that the invaders could be resisted. Madame Chiang Kai-shek took every opportunity to praise her American air advisor. She ensured he had access to the highest levels of government, smoothing over bureaucratic obstacles and shielding him from jealous rivals in the Chinese military. Together, she and Chennault became a formidable duo, the diplomat and the warrior, the strategist and the symbol. Yet even her influence had limits. By 1940, Japan had introduced its deadly new Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, faster and more maneuverable than anything China possessed. Day after day, the skies over Chongqing filled with the drone of Japanese bombers. Entire neighborhoods vanished under waves of fire. We could not defend the city, Chennault admitted. We could only endure. In the face of this devastation, the Chiangs decided to seek help abroad, specifically from the United States. If China could not build its own modern air force, perhaps America could supply one. Chennault was chosen to lead the mission. He would return to Washington, this time not as a rejected officer, but as the representative of an embattled nation asking for planes, pilots, and hope. In early 1941, carrying Madame Chiang's personal blessing and accompanied by her brother T.V. Sung, Chennault boarded a ship bound for San Francisco. His goal was bold and almost impossible: convince the American government, still officially neutral, to lend its men and machines to a foreign war. He would succeed beyond anyone's expectations. By early 1941, Claire Chennault was back on American soil, no longer a retired, half-forgotten officer, but the military emissary of a desperate nation. His mission was clear, though secret: recruit American pilots and ground crews to fight for China under a neutral flag. It was an extraordinary plan, illegal under U.S. law, risky politically, and daring militarily. But Chennault believed it could work. His ally was T.V. Sung, Madame Chiang's brother and one of China's most influential statesmen. Charming, well-connected, and fluent in English, Sung moved easily through Washington's political circles. Behind closed doors, he and Chennault met with a handful of powerful men: Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr., Navy Secretary Frank Knox, and Presidential Advisor Tommy the Cork Corcoran. Together, they persuaded President Franklin D. Roosevelt to quietly authorize the creation of a volunteer air force for China. On April 15, 1941, Roosevelt signed an unpublicized executive order permitting active-duty military personnel to resign temporarily from the U.S. Armed Forces to serve in a foreign military. The paperwork was disguised as civilian employment contracts under a Delaware corporation called China Defense Supplies Incorporated, a front company funded with $8.9 million from the Chinese government. It was, in every sense, a secret army. Chennault was given permission to purchase 100 Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk fighters, originally destined for Britain's Royal Air Force, but rejected as outdated. The planes were rugged, heavily armed, and could dive faster than almost any Japanese fighter, a perfect fit for the tactics Chennault had been preaching for years. Now he needed pilots. Recruiting began in the spring of 1941. Posters and word-of-mouth appeals spread quietly through Army Air Corps, Navy, and Marine bases. Those who joined would have to resign their commissions. There would be no official link to the U.S. military. The offer promised adventure, danger, and, crucially, money. The pay was astonishing by military standards: $250 to $750 a month, depending on position, plus free housing, food, travel, and interpreters, and a $500 bonus for every confirmed enemy plane destroyed. To war-hungry young men frustrated by years of peacetime duty, the offer was irresistible. "Here's your chance for real flying," recruiters whispered. "And when it's over, you'll have the experience of a lifetime and a fat bank account." By the summer of 1941, roughly 300 Americans had signed on, about 110 pilots, 150 mechanics, and a handful of support staff, clerks, armorers, radio technicians, and nurses. They came from every branch of the service. Half were Navy or Marine pilots, a third came from the Army Air Corps, and the rest were civilians, crop dusters, and test pilots. Their average age was 27. They were restless, daring, and only loosely disciplined. Many had nicknames that would soon become famous: Tex Hill, Greg Pappy Boyington, Charlie Bond, Ed Rector, Bob Neal, and others. Each man signed a one-year contract, packed his gear, and prepared to vanish from the official records. Because of America's neutrality laws, the operation had to be cloaked in secrecy. The pilots were issued false passports, listing them as students, missionaries, or even circus performers. They couldn't wear uniforms or carry weapons during transit. Their travel routes were circuitous, across the Pacific via San Francisco, Hawaii, Singapore, and finally Rangoon, Burma. Meanwhile, the P-40s were disassembled, packed into crates, and shipped separately by freighter. Their destination, Mingaladen Airfield, where they would be reassembled and tested before the unit moved to its training base at Taungoo, deep in the Burmese countryside. By July 7, 1941, the first group of volunteers, scruffy, sunburned, and wide-eyed, arrived at Taungoo. They found a primitive camp of bamboo huts, mud runways, and clouds of mosquitoes. There were no hangars, few tools, and less food. The heat was suffocating, the monsoon rains relentless. Waiting for them was their new commander, Colonel Lee Chennault. He was not what most had expected. To many, he seemed old and gaunt, his face deeply lined, his voice a gravelly rasp. But his eyes were sharp, and his authority undeniable. He looked like a tired farmer, one pilot recalled, until he started talking about air combat. Then he was 10 feet tall. Chennault wasted no time. Training began immediately. The Americans quickly learned that this was no holiday war. The Japanese Air Force, he told them, was aggressive, disciplined, and deadly. Their Mitsubishi Zeros and Nakajima Oscars could outturn any American fighter. The key to survival lay in not fighting their kind of fight. He drew diagrams on chalkboards explaining how the P-40's heavy frame could withstand steep dives and high speeds. "Your plane," he told them, "is a diving hawk. Use gravity as your ally. Strike fast, get out faster." He insisted they fly in pairs, covering each other's blind spots. He forbade heroic dogfights. "Never get into a turning contest with a Jap," he barked. "That's suicide. Use your head, not your ego." Many chafed under his strict discipline, but most came to respect him deeply. "He was tough," said one pilot, "but he was always right." Training was rough. 3 men died in crashes before the unit was even declared combat ready. Others washed out or quit. But those who stayed grew into a brotherhood, a team united by hardship, sweat, and a growing sense that they were part of something historic. By November 1941, the American Volunteer Group was ready for action. They had 3 squadrons. The first squadron, Adam and Eve. The second squadron, Panda Bears. The third squadron, Hell's Angels. Each squadron had its own insignia, its own culture, and its own swagger. Then, just as the final pieces were falling into place, history intervened. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The next day, the United States entered World War II. Overnight, Chennault's private air force went from secret mercenary unit to America's first line of defense in Asia. The Flying Tigers were about to take flight. When the sun rose over Taungoo, Burma, in December 1941, the men of the American Volunteer Group had no idea that the world they had left behind had just changed forever. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had plunged the United States into war. Overnight, Chennault's secret air force, once officially non-existent, became America's first force actively fighting Japan. Yet despite the headlines and political chaos, life at Taungoo remained brutally simple: train, sweat, fly, and fight mosquitoes. The P-40 Tomahawk fighters, rugged but unwieldy, stood lined up on muddy runways, their shark-nosed paint schemes glowering in the tropical heat. The monsoon rains had turned the airfield into a swamp, and supplies were scarce. The pilots slept in grass huts and ate rice, tea, and whatever local food could be found. It was here that Colonel Chennault hammered his men into shape. His style was strict and personal. He taught his pilots to think like hunters, not daredevils. "The Japanese will try to make you fight their way," he said, pacing before his men. "Don't play their game. Play ours." His lectures were more like combat sermons. He would draw diagrams of attack patterns on a chalkboard, then make his men repeat them in the air, over and over, until every move was instinct. From his rickety bamboo control tower, binoculars in hand, he watched each drill, shouting corrections into a handheld radio. "Too slow. Climb steeper. Keep your wingman in sight." His rules were uncompromising. Never dogfight a zero. The Japanese fighter could outturn and outclimb the heavier P-40. Attack from above at high speed. The Tomahawk's diving ability and firepower were its strengths. Make one pass, shoot, and break away. Surprise and discipline, not showmanship, would win the day. Fly in pairs. A lone pilot was a dead pilot. These tactics, dismissed by U.S. Air Corps strategists as cowardly back home, would soon prove revolutionary. By mid-December, Chennault divided his small force into two groups, one defending Kunming in China, the other supporting the British and Burmese near Rangoon. There were barely 60 P-40s in flying condition and fewer than 50 combat-ready pilots. It was a meager force to cover thousands of miles of hostile territory. Then, on December 20, 1941, came their first test. 10 Japanese Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers took off from Hanoi, heading for Kunming, a city they had raided many times without resistance. But this time, they met 4 P-40s of the Panda Bears squadron under Light Scarsdale Jack Newkirk. Diving out of the sun, the Flying Tigers ripped through the bomber formation, downing 4 in minutes. The survivors jettisoned their bombs and fled. Not a single American was lost. When the Tomahawks returned to Kunming, they performed slow victory rolls over the airfield as cheering Chinese soldiers waved from below. It was the Flying Tigers' first victory, and it sent shockwaves across Asia. 3 days later, the Hells Angels Squadron under Lieutenant Arvid Olsen joined forces with Britain's No. 67 Squadron RAF, flying stubby, outdated Brewster Buffaloes, to defend Rangoon from another massive bombing raid. Over the Gulf of Martaban, the Flying Tigers shot down several enemy bombers and fighters, though 2 of their own were lost. Chennault, grimly protective of his limited resources, called it a bad trade. But the real test came on Christmas Day, 1941. That morning, radar and observers reported over 70 Japanese bombers escorted by 30 to 40 fighters approaching Rangoon. Outnumbered 5-1, the Flying Tigers and their British allies scrambled to intercept. The sky filled with chaos, bombs exploding, tracers streaking, smoke twisting into spirals. The Tigers attacked in tight 2-plane formations, exactly as Chennault had drilled them. Diving in at high speed, they shredded enemy bombers before peeling away. The P-40's thick armor absorbed hits that would have torn lighter planes apart. By the end of the day, the AVG NRAF claimed 32 Japanese aircraft destroyed for the loss of only 2 P-40s and no pilots. It was one of the most lopsided aerial victories of the war. 3 AVG pilots became aces in a single afternoon, setting a record the unit would never surpass. Rangoon erupted in celebration. Civilians poured into the streets, waving flags of China and America. Newspapers hailed the Tiger Airmen, who had turned the tide of the skies. For the first time, Allied morale across Asia soared. Chennault, however, remained characteristically sober. "Don't let it go to your heads," he told his men. "The Japanese will be back. Stronger. Smarter. Next time, we'll have to be better." He was right. In the months that followed, the Flying Tigers would fight over Burma's jungles, Chinese mountains, and tropical rivers, always outnumbered, often outgunned, but never outmatched in spirit. They would become masters of improvisation, plugging bullet holes with chewing gum, painting tiger teeth on their planes for psychological effect, and flying as many as 8 sorties a day. Their legend had begun in blood and fire, but their finest hours and hardest tests still lay ahead. By the spring of 1942, the legend of the Flying Tigers was blazing across the world. Newspapers described them as a handful of Americans holding the skies of Asia, and for once, the hyperbole wasn't far from the truth. Outnumbered, undersupplied, and constantly moving, the Tigers managed to achieve what entire air forces had failed to do: check Japan's advance in the skies. But behind every victory was a grueling struggle for survival. The American volunteer group, AVG, was never more than a few hundred men, and at its peak, only about 50 pilots were combat-ready at any given time. Their aircraft, those shark-faced P-40 Tomahawks, were pushed far beyond their intended limits. Fuel, oil, ammunition, and spare parts had to travel a tortuous route by ship, train, and truck through India and Burma before finally reaching the airfields of Kunming and Loiwing. Every single item, down to the last spark plug, was precious. It was like trying to run an air force, Chennault later said, on what could fit in a single freight car. When planes were hit, they were rarely scrapped. Instead, the AVG's ground crews, a band of mechanics, armorers, and radio men who worked with little sleep and no safety gear, performed miracles daily. They patched bullet holes with tin sheets and rivets scavenged from wrecks. They rebuilt wings out of bamboo and wood. They melted down scrap metal to forge new parts. They were the unsung heroes of the Flying Tigers. One pilot described them best. "Those boys didn't just fix planes, they kept us alive. We'd come back with holes you could throw a football through, and the next morning the ship was ready to fly again." They worked in blistering Burmese heat and frigid Chinese mountain cold, often during air raids. When Japanese bombers hit Kunming, mechanics ducked behind sandbags until the bombs fell silent, then ran back to their planes, wrenches in hand. Some even waxed the P-40 fuselages to reduce drag, squeezing an extra 10 miles per hour of speed out of their aging machines. Food was scarce. The AVG pilots joked that they were half-starved mercenaries. Breakfast might be rice and tea. Dinner, whatever the locals could barter, often boiled vegetables or dried fish. Coca-Cola, whiskey, and American cigarettes were worth more than gold. Pilots swapped them for silk scarves or local trinkets, tokens of fleeting comfort in a foreign war. Yet morale remained remarkably high. There was a unique, rough-edged camaraderie among the Tigers. They called each other by nicknames Tex, RT, Bobby, Pappy, and developed a kind of frontier code. Fight hard, drink hard, and laugh whenever possible. Rangoon's smoky bars became legendary among Allied personnel. Pilots caroused with British soldiers, local girls, and even Chinese officers, their laughter echoing through the blackout nights. One of them later recalled, "We were young, we were winning, and we didn't know if we'd live another week, so we lived it all at once." Chennault tolerated the wild behavior as long as discipline held in the air. "They can drink what they like," he growled once, "as long as they don't drink before they fly." The AVG's aircraft maintenance crews often shared that same reckless bravery. During strafing runs, they manned anti-aircraft guns or grabbed rifles to fire at incoming bombers. More than one mechanic died on the ground defending the very planes he had just repaired. As the campaign dragged on, Japan's air power continued to grow. The Flying Tigers fought 31 major air battles in 10 weeks, sometimes flying 5 or 6 missions a day. Yet their kill ratio remained astonishing. 217 confirmed Japanese aircraft destroyed, another 43 probably destroyed, for the loss of just 16 P-40s and 6 pilots in combat. Tokyo radio began referring to them bitterly as the bandits of the sky. They threatened that any captured Flying Tiger would be executed as a criminal, not treated as a prisoner of war. But this only hardened the AVG's resolve. By March 1942, Rangoon had fallen. The British were retreating up the Burma Road, and the Tigers pulled back into China. From their new bases at Loiwing and Kunming, they flew daily missions, covering Allied convoys, strafing enemy supply lines, and intercepting bombers over the winding mountain roads that fed China's war effort. Conditions were terrible. Chennault's men used chewing gum to seal bullet holes in fuel tanks, adhesive tape to patch wings, and whiskey bottles filled with gasoline as makeshift incendiary bombs. When supplies ran low, they burned their own airfields to deny them to the enemy. Yet, incredibly, they kept fighting and winning. Every victory came with a price, and Chennault knew it. "We are a handful of men holding the sky by our fingernails," he wrote in a letter home. "But we'll hold it as long as we can." The Flying Tigers were becoming legends not because of their equipment or numbers, but because of their resilience, their sheer, unbreakable will to fight against impossible odds. And though few of them realized it at the time, their days as a volunteer unit were numbered. Soon the United States would take formal command of the air war in China, and the AVG, as the world had come to know it, would cease to exist.